Curt Hennig, better known to wrestling fans as Mr. Perfect, was more than just a great character from the 80s and 90s. He was one of the greatest technical wrestlers in history, with even Hulk Hogan calling him the best of the best. And behind the scenes, Hennig wasn't just respected for his skills, he was a friend to everyone and was always bringing laughter to the locker room. But behind the perfect image that he portrayed, Curt's real life had real struggles. His story is one of incredible talent, personal demons, and a tragic end that shocked the wrestling world. Curt was the son of Larry the Axe Hennig, one of the toughest and most respected pro wrestlers of his time. From the beginning, Curt wanted to follow in his dad's footsteps. He'd been around wrestling since before he could walk, and he'd absorbed so much knowledge that he already knew the business inside out. In his teenage years, Curt had proven himself to be a naturally gifted athlete, and he was offered scholarships in football and basketball at high school. But it was pro wrestling that was in his blood, and when he went to train with wrestling legend Vern Gagne, he couldn't believe how natural Curt's instincts were in the ring. In fact, he barely needed training at all, and it wasn't long before he debuted in the AWA. But Curt really felt the weight of expectation on his shoulders. Naturally, he was being constantly compared to his father, and it was a comparison that he wasn't ready to live up to at such a young age. In 1981, he got a job in the World Wrestling Federation, which allowed him to step out of his dad's shadow for a few months. He only stayed in the WWF for a short amount of time as his wife was about to give birth, but Vince McMahon was certainly impressed with Curt's ability. He went back to the AWA so he was closer to home, and this would prove to be a great decision in terms of his career. Curt teamed up with a young Scott Hall, and they eventually captured the World Tag Team Championship. They were one of the AWA's last truly great tag teams, but it was in singles competition where Curt really started to make a name for himself. In 1987, he reached his peak in the company when he defeated the legendary Nick Bockwinkel to become the World Heavyweight Champion. This was a title that his father Larry never managed to hold, and Curt felt that he'd finally stepped out of his shadow. He was the champion for over a year, but by the late 1980s, the AWA was starting to struggle. The writing was on the wall for the company, and it wasn't long before it shut down. But luckily for Curt, Vince McMahon had remembered him from all those years before. McMahon was impressed with the progress that Curt had made, both in terms of his in-ring work and his persona. During those years in the AWA, Curt had flourished into a confident and charismatic performer, but in 1988, charisma and in-ring skill just wasn't enough. Everyone had to have a gimmick. Vince McMahon created the character of Mr. Perfect thanks to Hennig's great success at high school. They filmed vignettes that have since become iconic of Mr. Perfect performing incredible sporting feats. From basketball to bowling, the character was the perfect athlete. They say that the best characters in wrestling are often the real person with the volume turned up, and that was certainly the case here. From late 1988 through most of 1989, Mr. Perfect built momentum as he went on an undefeated streak. He racked up wins on his way to becoming one of the best heels in the WWF. And between the character and his wrestling ability, Mr. Perfect was the complete package. And Vince McMahon was clearly impressed as he started booking Mr. Perfect in matches against the Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan. The winning streak came to an end at WrestleMania 6, where he lost to Brutus Beefcake of all people, but his push got back on track when he defeated Tito Santana in a tournament to win the Intercontinental Championship. Giving him Bobby Heenan as a manager was the icing on the cake, and these two were really entertaining together. Mr. Perfect seemed destined for the main event, and there was every reason to believe that he could eventually become the top heel in the company. But Curt had a big problem, a back problem. He'd started to have issues with his back in early 1991, and by the middle of the year, his pain was becoming unbearable. At SummerSlam, it would be Mr. Perfect versus Bret Hart for the Intercontinental title, and it would be Curt's last match for quite some time. The feud itself was really good. It was framed as a battle between two of the best technical wrestlers of the era, and in reality, that was completely true. They were both at the top of the pack in the WWF in terms of in-ring ability. Curt brought that cocky arrogance to the feud that made fans just want to cheer for Bret even louder. But when it came down to the match itself, Curt was in excruciating pain for the entire thing. It turned out that he was wrestling with a broken tailbone along with a bulging disc in his back. But he was determined not to forfeit the title. He battled through the pain to produce arguably the greatest WWF match of the early 90s. It looked like that this was going to be the end of a short but explosive career, because after the match, he stepped away from the ring. The doctors advised him to get spinal fusion surgery, but he never took that advice. Instead, he cashed out an insurance policy with Lloyd's of London that was apparently worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The key condition of the insurance payout was that Curt could no longer wrestle, which essentially meant that he was retired from active competition. But that certainly didn't mean that he was done with the WWF. McMahon gave Mr. Perfect a role next to him at the commentary table, and Curt was excited to take on this brand new assignment that would allow him to still contribute to the business. And it's safe to say that Curt was damn near perfect as a commentator. He was funny, he was sharp, and he knew the storylines inside out. He was always at his best when he had someone to bounce off, and that was proven in his banter with Vince McMahon at the commentary table. And that only continued when he became Ric Flair's executive consultant. Even when Flair was the one cutting the promo, Mr. Perfect's facial expressions in the background just enhanced it even further. In the year or so that they worked together, these two became really close friends. But of course, Curt got on with everyone. He was naturally funny and he loved to pull pranks and practical jokes backstage. But even during this time out of the ring, his back never fully healed, and he was using an increasing amount of prescription painkillers in order to mask the pain. The 1992 Survivor Series was supposed to be a tag match between The Ultimate Warrior and Randy Savage taking on Ric Flair and Razor Ramon, but just before the show, The Ultimate Warrior stormed out of the WWF. Vince really struggled to find a suitable replacement for the Warrior in order to carry on with the match, and so he turned to Curt. Curt really didn't want to come out of retirement because he was still getting that payout, but Vince ended up paying the remainder of the insurance settlement and a whole lot more on top, and that was a pretty good way to convince him to get back into the ring. They turned Mr. Perfect babyface for the first time in his career, and of course Curt was great at playing a good guy too. It was just another role in wrestling that he took to like a duck to water. He sent Ric Flair packing back to WCW in a loser leaves town match in January 1993, and then he went on to feud with the likes of Shawn Michaels and Lex Luger, but it never felt like Mr. Perfect was going to become the WWF champion. It was clear that Vince was never going to take the risk of pushing him, considering the state of his back, and Curt knew it too. There were reports from the time of Curt getting annoyed and frustrated that not only was Vince passing him up for the WWF title, he was also passing him up for the Intercontinental title. But that's no surprise. Curt was clearly diminished in the ring. He couldn't move like he used to, and he was terrified of making his back even worse, despite all of the pain medication that he was taking. At the end of 1993, he had to step away from the ring once again. Mr. Perfect appeared as a special guest referee and commentator at different times, but he didn't maintain the same presence as before. In 1996, Vince McMahon was pushing for Mr. Perfect to get back into the ring once again, but Curt wasn't so sure. He was about to receive a $300,000 lump sum from his insurance deal, money that he wanted to retire on, but all of a sudden, Lloyd's of London decided to not pay out. Curt believed that Vince was in some way responsible for this as a way to get him back into the ring. Whether that's true or not was never proven either way, but he was so infuriated that he reached out to Eric Bischoff to see if there was any interest in bringing him to WCW. When the men met up with each other, they clicked instantly, and according to Bischoff himself, it felt like he'd known Curt for years. But there was just one problem. Curt was still under contract with the WWF until February 1997. After that meeting, Curt stopped showing up for his WWF commitments. He just totally no-showed all of his bookings. He'd been scheduled to work on commentary and to present some of the WWF's peripheral shows at the time, but he just didn't show up. And so Vince tried to sue WCW for contract tampering, but it was no use. Curt was out the door and headed for Atlanta. It was in a tag team match at Bash at the Beach 1997 that he made his WCW debut. Curt did have some fun moments in WCW, including his run as US champion and tag team champion, and of course he was part of the NWO. And Curt was glad to be back alongside one of his best friends in the business, Ric Flair. And just like Rick, Curt liked to party. His drug use started to increase, and he was starting to look bloated and tired. Curt had always found it easy to hide his substance abuse, but now there were reports of him showing up to Nitro while still intoxicated. His contract expired in the summer of 2000, and he decided to take a break from wrestling. So it was a real surprise when Mr. Perfect appeared at the 2002 Royal Rumble. It was great to see him back, and he appeared to be having a lot of fun back in the WWF, and it was hoped that he'd stick around for a few years at least. There was certainly plenty of guys in the locker room who'd grown up watching him, and they were excited to work with a true legend in the business. But just 5 months after his re-debut, he was gone. WWE released him. He got into trouble during the infamous plane ride from hell. This was a commercial flight travelling back from the UK to the US, where several wrestlers behaved very badly indeed. Curt ended up getting drunk and started grappling with Brock Lesnar, and the two of them crashed into the emergency exit. There were lots of incidents that went down on that flight, and many of the people involved were fired because of it, and Curt was one of them. For a few months after, he appeared on various independent wrestling shows. Then, on a morning of February 2003, he was found dead in a hotel room in Florida. He died from acute cocaine intoxication, and his father later stated that steroids and painkillers also contributed to his death. Curt was just 44 years old, and he left behind a wife and 4 children. Even now, more than 2 decades after his death, Curt Hennig is still considered to be one of the greatest professional wrestlers to have ever lived.